everyone, Eric here, this time with a video about the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what this is, but in case you're not, this is an accessory for your Super Nintendo that allows you to take Nintendo Game Boy games, pop them in there like that, you pop this into your SNES, and you can play Game Boy games on your TV in color, kind of, with the Super Nintendo controller, which is pretty cool, especially for geezers like me who it's hard to see this little tiny pea green screen anymore. So now a lot of people I've heard say don't think this is worth owning, that it's better to have the GameCube Game Boy player, which is a cool peripheral. It does let you play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on your TV, but personally, I find the GameCube controller kind of awkward. Also, there's actually a whole line of games that are labeled Super Game Boy Game Pack. I don't know if you can see that, but they have special features that are built in just for the Super Game Boy, and those features are not accessible with the Game Boy player. Only works with the Super Game Boy. Also, you don't need a disc for this. If you find this at Goodwill or something, and these are cheap, these are like $10 to $15, you're good to go. You don't need a startup disc or anything like that. I find Game Boy players a lot at Goodwill, but they don't have the startup disc, and then you go look on eBay and it's like 40, 50 bucks for the startup disc, and you probably already spent $15, $20 on the Game Boy player. These things are $10 to $15, even when you find them in a retail setting, 10 to 15 bucks, and they just work. Now, originally, it did include this really cool Super Game Boy guide. It came in a big box, I think it was similar in size to like the Earthbound box or the Mario Paint box. Unfortunately, I don't have a complete in box, but I do have the Super Game Boy, and I have the guide it came with. And this is really cool to have too, if you can find this with it, because this has just, not only how to use it and everything, but just lots of really cool information on, Game Boy games and Game Boy games that are specifically designed for the Super Game Boy. So let's take a closer look at the guide and the Super Game Boy and see why this is still something that's worth owning today. All right, so here's the Super Game Boy up close and personal. And as you can see, it's basically just a supersized Super Nintendo cartridge with a Game Boy game slot in it. So here's a regular Super Nintendo cartridge just for comparison. You can see the Super Game Boy is almost twice as big. Now the cool thing about the Super Game Boy was that in addition to letting you play Game Boy games on your TV, it let you add some color to the games. As you can see here on some of the stuff on the cover, it would take old Game Boy games and replace the 4 shades of that pea green that were available with different colors. And also some games that were released after this was released, which this was released in June of 1994 in the United States. But after it was released, certain games that bear this logo, this Super Game Boy Game Pack logo here, have special features that are designed that only work with the Super Game Boy. For example, even more enhanced color is programmed into them. In some cases, games like Killer Instinct allow for 2 players on the Super Nintendo with the Super Game Boy, which is pretty cool. Space Invaders. There's a Space Invaders game for the Game Boy that's a Super Game Boy Game Pack, and it actually has a version of Space Invaders that's only playable on the Super Nintendo through the Super Game Boy. I actually think this is kind of a complete set, or a cool complete set to collect for, so I think I'm actually going to try and get all of the Super Game Boy game packs. I have 2. I went through my collection. I've got this Game & Watch Gallery, and then I've got this Ken Griffey Jr. baseball game. So we'll check these 2 out later on in the video when we see how this works. But the other cool thing about the Super Game Boy is that not only does it have special features for certain games built into it, but you can do cool things like this. Like you can put the Game Boy camera in it and plug this into your Super Nintendo and use the Game Boy camera on your Super Nintendo, which is pretty cool. You can't do that with the Game Boy player. Also, Hori made a special controller that I think was only available in Japan, but you can import it. And it's laid out more like the Game Boy, and it was made specifically for playing Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo. So that's a really neat controller that I'd like to get to at some point. And if I ever do, I'll probably do a review of it. Now, it's also important to point out that the Super Game Boy will play regular Game Boy games, like these, the gray carts. It will also play some of the later black carts that released. Now, these are games that will work on the Game Boy or the Game Boy Color. So these will work just as their regular Game Boy games in this, so it'll play black carts. It will, however, not play Game Boy Color exclusive games. Now those are games that are in this clear kind of case, and they say Game Boy Color across the top. And yes, I have a Dragon Tales game, and yes, I probably will be doing a video about this at some point, so keep an eye out for that. But anyways, so it will play, like I said, the gray and the black carts, but it will not play the clear Game Boy Color exclusive carts. So let's take a closer look at this guide for a second. Now, like I said, this guide came with it originally, and it was packaged in the box, and this is really cool. You don't have to have this to use the Game Boy Color, but I'm a big paper collector, so I like to have these kind of things. It's kind of laid out like some of the old Nintendo Power guides that came out at the time, like the Game Atlas and stuff. And it has, you know, your basic operation of the unit, which is really simple. Plug it in, and play. But what a lot of people don't notice too, or realize when they just find it by itself, is that you can actually use the Super Nintendo mouse with it. You just plug it in the second controller, so that's pretty cool. And you can use that to access some of the menus. And then the guide obviously walks you through all the different menus and stuff like that, which we'll take a look at them. But then it also walks you through, you know, customizing the colors. Now there's like some presets you can pick, or you can create your own color combination on some of the older games. And it walks you through that, and then you can save it, and it'll spit out a password. It doesn't have like a battery save feature, but it will spit out a password that you can write down, and then when you enter that password, it'll set that particular color palette. What's really cool, you know, and it gives you tips and stuff like that, and even like challenges, finding new challenges, like making, you know, setting the color palette up so that Mario is invisible. Well, yeah, that's going to make the game really hard. That's a challenge. Things like that, which are neat. You can also personalize the border around the game, which is cool, and it walks you through how to do that. But once you get to the end, it's pretty cool. It has a little thing here where it explains the Super Game Boy games, and these are the games with special features. And I think Donkey Kong was the first one that was released. And one of the special features available to it is it has this really cool like arcade border around it. And also the Super Game Boy games, like I mentioned earlier, they have some added color. And then what's really cool here at the end of the guide is there's basically like a greatest hits guide for Game Boy games, and it gives you, you know, passwords that you can punch in to just preset the colors already to make some of these games look really good on the Super Game Boy. And then it's also kind of a strategy guide too, and it has, like I said, some really, you know, Super Mario Land 1 and 2. It's basically like a greatest hits. Several pages devoted to each game, Mario Land. So you have the entire Super Mario Land series. I believe Zelda's in here. The Donkey Kong game, of course. So this is, if you can find this guide, it is a really cool companion to have with your Super Game Boy. Let's take a look at the Super Game Boy in operation and see how it works.
So here's the boot screen for the Super Game Boy. And that's cool, I like that. Let's take a look at Super Mario Land first. But actually, let's pause it, and then if you push the L and R buttons on the controller, that'll pull up the Super Game Boy menu. And this first menu item lets you pick one of the predefined color options that are available. As you can see, there's a lot of predefined color schemes available already. Ooh, that's bad. And you can see in the thumbnail it shows you what each of the 4 shades, how they're going to be colored. And there's actually 4 pages of these predefined color schemes. So there's a lot of just predefined ones right off the bat. And then this menu item lets you pick which border you want to use. And this first item, this first icon, this only lights up if you have a Super Game Boy enhanced game inserted. But otherwise you just have these ones available, and we can take a look at each one. This movie theater one's kind of cool. I do like this one. But I still think my favorite is just the original Game Boy border. Let's set it back to the Game Boy. And then here you can pick the 2 different control types that are available. I like Type B. I think that button layout is a little bit more natural and similar to the Game Boy. Now this menu item lets you draw your own custom border. And you can see there's lots of colors available to use. And we can take a look at my artistic ability. You see here it won't let me draw in the picture, only in the border. But if I go change this option down here, then I can just draw all over the place. And that's a masterpiece. Let's try it out with the game. That doesn't make playing the game difficult at all. Alright, let's clear it out. We'll set it back to the Game Boy. Now this item, this last one, it lets you actually pick your own color scheme, define your own colors. And you can see you have a lot of different colors available. You can rotate this palette, it'll show you the different colors. And then you basically just pick each color and tell it which of the four shades the Game Boy had available to replace with that color, and you can see how it's going to change the picture as you do it. And then you can clear it out and set it back to the default. You see the password up at the top? You'll notice that change as you make each color selection, and that's the password that you can note down if you decide that you want to use a color scheme that you like later on. If you want to use it again, you can just come up here and enter that password in. Let's enter one of the ones that the guide that came with it actually suggests for Super Mario Land. I'm entering the code that it suggests for the pyramid-themed levels. One of my few complaints with this thing is the password entry. You hover over each of the numbers and then use the A and B button to scroll up and down through the numbers, and it's kind of weird. It kind of sucks that you have to have the mouse cursor blocking the number that you're trying to update. But it's just that's a small gripe. Let's close out the menus and unpause the game and try this color scheme. Now, as I'm playing Super Mario Land for the first time in a long time, I'm remembering that the physics are kind of weird. They're different than how Mario games normally are, and it's kind of making it difficult for me to play this. I'm gonna have to go back and play this game again, because I was really good at this game years ago. Ah, it was terrible. Let's take a look at a different game. Now this is Game & Watch Gallery, and this is one of these Super Game Boy Enhanced Game Boy games. So you can see there's a little bit more color depth available, and also you see this icon is lit up. The first one here, the little spinny face, which is telling us that it's using the special background that's built into the game for the Super Game Boy. Let's try Octopus. Another neat touch is when it's showing you how the controls work, it actually displays a Super Nintendo controller if you're playing this in the Super Game Boy, but if you're playing it in a regular Game Boy, it shows the Game Boy controls. So that's just another neat little touch. I like how the octopus looks like it's gonna have an aneurysm when it catches you. I gotta get back with at least one load of treasure. let's take a look at another game. Oil Panic. I really like Oil Panic. This is a fun one. I like the modern version of it. So the idea is you have to catch these oil drips in your little containers that you're holding, and then you have to dump them out the correct side so that Yoshi catches them. So yeah, this is definitely one of my more favorite games on this compilation. But as far as the Super Game Boy goes, I would definitely recommend grabbing one of these. They're so cheap. They're $10 to $15, and it's really cool to be able to play your Game Boy games on the TV and not have to try and hunt down some startup disc like you need for the Game Boy player. So yeah, definitely pick one up if you see it. Now, I did show a Ken Griffey Jr. game earlier. I'm not going to abuse you with that game. That game was horrible. That's probably the worst baseball game I've ever played, and I think I'm going to do a separate video about it. But anyways, thanks for watching this one. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and take care. Hey, if you got a few more minutes, why don't you check out one of my video game reviews here, or if you're into 80s and 90s cartoons, I highly recommend that video on VHS tapes up there. Also, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to check out my links to the social media junk down below, and thanks again for watching.